It started with a diary that wasn't supposed to exist. Chester Hansen was a journalism graduate from Syracuse, sharp, observant, and completely out of place in a military headquarters. He had been handpicked as Omar Bradley's personal aide, and from the moment he arrived, he did what journalists do. He wrote everything down. Conversations, arguments, private assessments of generals who outranked him by 3 stars. By the time the war ended, he had filled notebooks with over 250,000 words, an archive so detailed, so intimate, that one Pulitzer Prize-winning historian would later call it, surely, among the most unusual documents ever written from within a major combat commander's headquarters. Diaries were forbidden in the European theater. Everyone knew it. Bradley knew it too. He never told Hansen to stop. That decision, quiet, deliberate, and perfectly calculated, tells you more about Omar Bradley than almost anything else in the historical record. Because Hansen's diary did not just survive the war, it became the foundation of one of the most successful image-building operations in American military history. To understand how, you have to go back to 1943 and a problem Dwight Eisenhower couldn't ignore. George Patton was everywhere. His name dominated every headline, his face filled every newsreel. And after the infamous soldier-slapping incidents, those headlines had turned catastrophic. The Army needed a different face, someone the American public could trust, someone calm, presentable, and above all, manageable. Eisenhower's solution was not a policy or a press release. It was a journalist. He personally instructed war correspondent Ernie Pyle, the most beloved reporter in the entire theater, to, in his words, go and discover Bradley. Pyle spent 3 days with Bradley and produced a 6-part series syndicated across hundreds of American newspapers, a reach that would only grow as the war continued. The image he constructed was precise and deliberate. The quiet Missourian in wire-rimmed glasses. The soldier's general. The humble man from America's heartland who never raised his voice, never chased glory, and might, if you passed him on the street, pass for a professor. Life magazine followed with a portrait praising Bradley's remarkable gentleness, claiming he never gave an order without saying, "please," first. It was masterfully done. It was also, in critical ways, fiction. Brigadier General S.L.A. Marshall, the Army's own combat historian, whose literal job was interviewing frontline soldiers after battle, reached a very different verdict. He said the common man image had been played up by Pyle, that the GIs were not impressed with Bradley, that they scarcely knew him, and that the idea he was idolized by the average soldier was, in Marshall's own word, rot. The brand had been built. But the record told a different story, and that record was only just beginning. George Patton kept a diary throughout the war, not because anyone asked him to, because he couldn't stop himself. He was a man of violent opinions, and he needed somewhere to put them. Martin Blumenson, the historian who spent years editing those papers into publishable form, described what he found inside as remarkable for their consistency. Across years of entries, across campaigns in North Africa, Sicily, France, and Germany, Patton's private assessment of Omar Bradley never really changed. And it was not kind. He called Bradley a man of great mediocrity. In one entry, he catalogued what he considered Bradley's genuine qualifications for high command: wearing glasses, having a strong jaw, talking at length while saying very little, and being a hunting companion of Army Chief of Staff George Marshall. In another, he wrote simply that Bradley utterly lacked what Patton called it: that indefinable quality of battlefield instinct that separates generals who win from generals who manage. In still another, he grouped Bradley and First Army Commander Courtney Hodges together and wrote that their great virtue was getting along by doing nothing. These were not the frustrations of a bad day. They were a verdict, written repeatedly across years. On Operation Cobra, Bradley's breakout plan from Normandy, the operation that would eventually crack the German lines wide open. Patton wrote in private that it was a very timid operation, though he acknowledged it was the best planned effort so far. That combination, faint praise wrapped in fundamental criticism, captures Patton's view of Bradley precisely. Competent preparation, insufficient nerve. But the sharpest entry, the one that cuts deepest, is about credit. Patton wrote that he did not wish any more of his ideas to be used without acknowledgement, because that, he said, was exactly what happened whenever he shared them with Bradley orally. That is not battlefield rivalry. That is a specific accusation of intellectual theft, written in private, with no audience to perform for. Blumenson documented across the Patton papers that Patton believed Bradley had adopted several of his operational concepts during the Normandy campaign, including key elements of Cobra's broad design, and presented them as his own to Eisenhower. Whether that charge is entirely fair remains debatable. What is not debatable is that Patton felt it strongly enough to write it down, more than once, when no one was watching. Now, Patton's diary is not scripture. Historian Daniel Feldman published research in 2021 demonstrating that Patton edited his own entries over time, meaning some passages may reflect hindsight rather than feeling in the moment. And Patton had powerful personal reasons to resent Bradley, who had once served beneath him and ended the war outranking him. That bitterness is real and worth accounting for. But bias does not explain consistency. And across years of private entries, in campaigns separated by thousands of miles, the judgment never shifted. Whatever Patton's flaws as a witness, he was watching the same man everyone else was watching, and writing down what he saw. The question is whether anyone in command was paying attention. In August 1943, Omar Bradley made a decision that reveals more about his command philosophy than any battle plan he ever drew up. He relieved Major General Terry Allen and Brigadier General Teddy Roosevelt, Jr. from the 1st Infantry Division, the most battle-hardened American combat unit in the entire Mediterranean theater. British General Sir Harold Alexander, who had commanded armies in 2 world wars, called Allen the best division leader he had seen in either of them. Even Bradley himself, in his own memoir, admitted that none excelled the unpredictable Terry Allen in the leadership of troops. That was his own assessment, in his own words, of the man he then removed from command. The official justification was discipline. Bradley wrote that the 1st Division had become temperamental and disdainful of regulations, that it had developed a swagger, a defiance of institutional norms that he found corrosive. The immediate trigger was a failed assault on the Sicilian town of Troina, but that assault had been carried out by a regiment temporarily attached from the 9th Division, making it a peculiar basis on which to fire the man who hadn't planned or led it. What actually drove the decision was personal. Bradley was a teetotaler. He found Allen's well-known drinking repugnant. He disliked Allen's instinct for independent action, his habit of running his division as though it answered to him rather than to the chain of command above. Bradley wrote that he wanted commanders who were judicious, reasonable, and likable, and then added, revealingly, like himself. The men he wanted around him were reflections, not challengers. Allen was devastated. His division artillery commander recalled it was painful to see him break down. Allen later told an aide he had been shanghaied. Roosevelt, stripped of his command alongside him, wrote to Bradley begging for any assignment at all, writing that he would swim ashore on D-Day with a howitzer strapped to his back, if that was what it took. Roosevelt did lead troops ashore at Utah Beach. He died of a heart attack weeks later. Eisenhower, when he learned the full circumstances of the firing, called it a terrible injustice. And then George Marshall did something that quietly demolished Bradley's judgment entirely. He gave Allen a 2nd Division to command, the raw, untested 104th Infantry, the Timberwolves, and watched what happened. Allen took a division of draftees and turned them into one of the most effective fighting formations in Europe. They entered combat in the Netherlands in October 1944 and fought for 195 consecutive days. Their casualty rates were lower than comparable divisions. By war's end, they had captured over 50,000 prisoners. When Bradley finally visited Allen in Cologne and was forced to acknowledge what the Timberwolves had become, Allen's reply carried everything you needed to know about the previous 2 years. "Gee, Brad," he said, "the 1st and the 9th are in damned fast company." Bradley didn't fire Terry Allen because Allen couldn't fight. He fired him because Allen wouldn't comply. And the difference between those two things, between battlefield effectiveness and institutional conformity, is the difference between what Bradley claimed to value and what he actually rewarded. It was not an isolated incident. It was the entire system, made visible in a single decision. June 6, 1944, the most documented day in the history of modern warfare. And at the center of it, watching from the deck of the cruiser USS Augusta, several miles offshore, was Omar Bradley, unable to communicate, unable to intervene, and by mid-morning, seriously considering abandoning the beach entirely. That fact alone should give us pause. The planning failures at Omaha Beach did not emerge from chaos or bad luck alone. Several of them were the direct result of decisions Bradley made over the explicit objections of his own officers. Major General Leonard Giroux, commanding the 5th Corps that would land at Omaha, and his staff, had advocated strongly for 2 specific measures. First, a pre-dawn landing, giving engineers critical extra time to clear German beach obstacles before the tide came in. Second, a longer naval bombardment to suppress the heavily fortified German positions before the first wave hit shore. Bradley rejected both. The naval bombardment at Omaha lasted approximately 40 minutes. At Utah Beach, the guns fired for several hours, and the beach defenses were largely neutralized before American boots touched sand. At Omaha, the defenders were still fully operational when the landing craft ramps went down. The result was immediate and catastrophic. Of the 29 amphibious DD tanks actually launched to support the infantry at Omaha, 27 sank in the rough seas before reaching shore. Engineer teams tasked with clearing lanes through beach obstacles suffered over 40% casualties in the first hour alone. By mid-morning, nearly 2,500 Americans had been killed or wounded, and the beach was a burning chaos of disabled vehicles, capsized craft, and men pinned against a seawall with nowhere to go. Bradley, watching from Augusta, received fragmented, desperate reports and reached a conclusion that history has largely buried. He considered evacuating Omaha and redirecting follow-on waves to Utah. He didn't. But the fact that it was a genuine option, that the entire operation teetered that close to failure, is its own verdict on the planning that preceded it. What saved Omaha was not Bradley's command decisions. It was individual courage operating far below his line of sight. Colonel George Taylor of the 16th Infantry Regiment told his pinned men that there were 2 kinds of people on that beach, those who were dead and those who were going to die, and that they had better start moving. Brigadier General Norman Cota of the 29th Division walked upright through machine gun fire, rallying men off the seawall with sheer force of presence. Those men salvaged a situation that Bradley's planning had brought to the edge of collapse. There were factors genuinely beyond anyone's control that morning. The weather, the unexpected presence of the German 352nd Division, the brutal geometry of the terrain. Omaha was extraordinarily complex, and any honest account must acknowledge that. But complexity does not excuse overruling your own officer's specific warnings, watching those warnings prove correct in real time, and then allowing the resulting narrative to credit the outcome as a command success. The men who crossed that beach deserved better planning, and the history that followed deserved more honesty. There is a telling detail buried near the end of Omar Bradley's memoirs. The Hürtgen Forest, the costliest sustained American engagement on the entire Western Front, a battle that consumed 6 divisions and produced approximately 33,000 casualties over 5 grinding months, receives barely a mention. A few sentences, a paragraph or two, then silence. That silence, more than any admission, is its own confession. The Hürtgen Forest sits on the German-Belgian border, 50 square miles of dense, ancient woodland that in the autumn of 1944 became a killing ground unlike anything American forces encountered in Western Europe. The terrain negated every advantage the United States Army possessed. Air power was useless beneath a canopy so thick that bombers couldn't identify targets. Armor couldn't maneuver on the narrow fire breaks between trees. Artillery, normally America's most decisive weapon, became actively counterproductive. Shells detonated in the treetops and rained razor-sharp wood splinters on attackers and defenders alike. The Germans had a name for them: tree bursts. American medics had other words. And yet Bradley kept sending men in. His post-war justification was strategic, that the objective had always been to seize the Roar River dams, controlling the water supply that could flood American positions downstream. Historian Rick Atkinson examined that claim against the documentary record and found it to be retroactive fabrication. Bradley's own war diary did not note the need to control the Roar dams until December 4, 1944, months after the fighting began. The original rationale for attacking through the Hürtgen was far simpler and far less defensible: to clear the forest as a perceived threat to the Allied flank. No defined strategic objective, no coherent endgame, just a forest that felt dangerous, and 6 divisions fed into it, one after another. The 28th Infantry Division's experience captures the human cost most precisely. General Norman Cota, the same officer who had walked upright through machine gun fire at Omaha Beach, received orders requiring him to send 3 regiments simultaneously along diverging paths toward 3 separate objectives across a 150-mile front, with his division attacking entirely alone. Cota was, according to the record, perplexed and deeply unhappy. He found the orders too directive, too rigid, leaving nothing for him or his staff except blind execution of a plan imposed from above. His objections were noted and largely ignored. The 28th Division suffered 6,184 casualties in approximately 1 week, an entire fighting division effectively destroyed. Individual regiments within it were gutted beyond recognition. When Eisenhower and Bradley visited Cota's headquarters after the carnage, Eisenhower looked around and said quietly, "Well, Dutch, it looks like you got a bloody nose." Shortly afterward, Hodges recommended Cota's relief, effectively punishing the division commander for faithfully executing a plan that had been handed to him from above. Even the Germans were baffled. Major General Rudolf Gersdorf, Chief of Staff of the German 7th Army, said his command could not understand the reason for the American attacks in the Hürtgen at all, because the terrain denied the attackers every advantage they possessed. When your enemy cannot understand your strategy, that is not a compliment. Bradley's greatest failure in the Hürtgen was not the initial decision to attack. Commanders make mistakes, and mistakes in warfare are inevitable. His failure was the refusal to stop. By October 1944, every intelligence assessment confirmed that the forest was a meat grinder with no viable exit. The 9th Division had already lost 4,500 men in the opening September attacks and gained barely 2 miles. The information existed. The picture was clear. The grinding continued regardless, and the men who paid for that refusal did so in trench foot, tree bursts, and combat exhaustion, in a forest that history has largely forgotten and Bradley's memoirs barely acknowledged. They deserved at least that much. By August 1944, something extraordinary was happening in France. Operation Cobra had cracked the German lines wide open. Patton's Third Army was sweeping south and east with stunning speed, and for one brief, luminous moment, the entire German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army, hundreds of thousands of men, their equipment, their command staffs, their institutional knowledge, stood on the edge of encirclement. 20 miles. That was all that separated Patton's forces pushing north toward Falaise from the Canadians pushing south. 20 miles to close the pocket, trap 2 German armies, and potentially end the war in France months ahead of schedule. Bradley halted Patton at Argentan. His stated reasoning was caution, that he doubted Patton's ability to hold a line across the narrow neck against a desperate German breakout attempt. He did not consult Montgomery. He did not push for a coordinated Allied closing of the gap. He simply stopped the advance, told Patton to hold his shoulder, and then, over the following 2 days, allowed half of the 15th Corps to be redirected eastward toward the Seine, effectively abandoning the encirclement at the precise moment it was within reach. Estimates of the German forces that escaped through the Falaise Gap range from 20,000 to over 100,000 troops, depending on methodology. What is not disputed is who escaped. The headquarters staffs of both the 7th Army and the 5th Panzer Army, the experienced command cadres who would spend the next 4 months rebuilding shattered formations east of the Seine, walked out through the gap Bradley chose not to close. When Eisenhower toured the Falaise pocket after it finally sealed, he called the carnage inside unimaginable. Roads choked with destroyed vehicles and dead horses for miles. But the men who should have been trapped there were already gone. They reappeared in December in the Ardennes. In early December 1944, Brigadier General Kenneth Strong, SHAEF's senior intelligence officer, traveled personally to Bradley's headquarters to warn of a possible German offensive building in the Ardennes. Bradley's response, according to multiple accounts, was 3 words: "Let them come." Patton's own intelligence chief had been raising similar alarms since late November. Patton himself noted in his diary that First Army was making a terrible mistake leaving the front dangerously thin, and that a German buildup was highly probable. When the offensive struck on December 16th, Bradley was in Versailles. He dismissed the initial reports as localized attacks. It was Eisenhower, not Bradley, who immediately grasped the scale of what was happening and ordered the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions into the fight. Bradley's 12th Army Group then lost communications with 1st Army for more than 48 hours. His headquarters in Luxembourg City sat south of the German penetration, physically cut off from 2 of his 3 armies. Eisenhower transferred temporary command of 1st and 9th Armies to Montgomery. A purely geometric decision, since Montgomery sat north of the penetration and could actually reach them. Bradley threatened to resign. He told Bedell Smith that if the order stood, he ought to be relieved. Carlo d'Este assessed that reaction as itself providing ample justification for Eisenhower's decision. Because a theater commander who makes operational choices based on personal humiliation is not making them based on the battle. The German forces that escaped at Falaise had come back. Bradley had not seen them coming. And 33,000 Americans paid for both failures simultaneously. In war, the consequences of caution do not stay contained. They compound. Omar Bradley outlived almost everyone who could contradict him, and he used that time carefully. Chester Hansen, the aide with the forbidden diary, became Bradley's ghostwriter, producing the 1951 memoir A Soldier's Story from his wartime notebooks, collecting half the book's royalties in return. The most important primary source for understanding Bradley's headquarters had been written by the man whose career depended on Bradley's reputation. The narrative filter was not applied to the archive. It was built into it. When Bradley died in 1981, a second memoir appeared, A General's Life, co-authored by Clay Blair, who admitted openly that Bradley had never finished the World War II section before his death. Blair wrote the remainder in Bradley's first-person voice. The result, by Blair's own description, was half Bradley, half Blair, a posthumous document settling scores with Montgomery, Patton, and Eisenhower in a dead man's words that no one could verify or dispute. Then there was Hollywood. Bradley's second wife, Kitty, a former screenwriter 29 years his junior, introduced him to producer Frank McCarthy and secured Bradley's role as technical advisor on the 1970 film Patton. The film, starring George C. Scott, was built partly on Bradley's memoir and made entirely without Patton's diaries or his family's cooperation. For a generation of Americans, that film became the definitive portrait of George Patton, a portrayal shaped in significant measure by the man who had called him a mediocrity in private and outlived him by 26 years. S.L.A. Marshall, reviewing the film, was characteristically blunt. He said the Bradley name received heavy billing on a picture that presented a victorious, glory-seeking buffoon. Carlo d'Este observed that for nearly 50 years, America's collective understanding of Patton had been filtered through a popular film and the private opinions of a general who detested him. The historian consensus has shifted decisively in the decades since. Rick Atkinson wrote that Bradley actively contributed to the mythology surrounding his own competence through two carefully constructed memoirs. Stephen Osad, whose biography won the 2018 Society for Military History Distinguished Book Award, organized his entire analysis around Bradley's lifelong inability to accept responsibility for failure. Conrad Crane, Chief of Historical Services at the Army Heritage and Education Center, named Bradley the most overrated leader of World War II, a reputation, Crane concluded, that was probably better than he deserved. Where historians still find genuine merit is in Bradley's organizational capacity. Keeping a 1.3 million-man Army group supplied, coordinated, and functioning across a 400-mile front is a real achievement, and dismissing it entirely would be its own distortion. Bradley was a capable military administrator. The myth sold him as something greater, a battlefield genius, a soldier's soldier, the humble conscience of the American Army. The real Omar Bradley was neither the saint of Ernie Pyle's dispatches nor the cartoon villain of the harshest revisionism. He was a man who consistently chose caution over exploitation, compliance over competence, and narrative over accountability. He fired the finest division commander in the theater for drinking. He kept the general who presided over the Hürtgen disaster because Hodges was quiet and agreeable. He sent 33,000 men into a forest with no coherent objective, and rewrote history to claim there had been one. And through all of it, the diary, the memoirs, the Hollywood film, the carefully managed silences, he won the one battle he never lost. The battle for how he would be remembered. The men who carried rifles through the Hürtgen, who crossed Omaha in the first wave, who watched the Germans escape at Falaise and then met them again in December. They deserved commanders who valued winning battles at least as much as winning the narrative. That is not a small distinction. In 1944, it was the difference between coming home and not coming home at all.